Now that our viewers have had a chance to think and discuss about the standards relative to their own school systems, let me ask you this, Carol. What does it mean to connect the IEP to the standards in the general curriculum?
You know, I have a good friend who is an excellent teacher. She does a lot of direct instruction. And she always taught me that one of the ways of looking at what something means is first to look at what it does not mean. So let's take a look at what it does not mean first. It does not mean writing goals on your IEP that restate the standards. That was one of the first things that I learned when I first started doing this training, was that there had been a training in this one state where everyone was expected that in order to make that connection, there was an expectation that you would see the standards as goals on the IEP. That is not what we're talking about. It does not mean that you only use the standards, and that's it when determining goals. And it does not mean that you will assume that every student will work only on grade level content. What it does mean is that we refer to the standards to determine and to understand what the expectations are at the grade level. We use them to guide and as a guide to determine what's important for students to learn and be able to do. If we want our students to be able to meet those expectations at the grade level, we have to know what they are, and we have to use them as a guide. And then we conduct an analysis to determine the gap between what is expected at grade level and what the student's current skills and knowledge base is. So there are some general steps to follow. First of all, we have to consider the grade level standards. And in order to do that, we examine the benchmarks. Different standards are written differently, so your state might call them something different, but essentially we're looking at the standards and then looking at the benchmarks for getting to that standard. We discuss what is expected in the way of knowledge and skills in order to demonstrate the standards. But then we also have to think about what are the prerequisite knowledge and skills that lead to those standards. So the first thing is to make sure that we really do have a good understanding of the standards and the prerequisite skills and knowledge that would lead to those standards. The second thing that we want to do then is to examine our students' current data to determine where the student is in relation to those grade level standards. So we compare the expectations of the standards to the student's current instructional level, and we call that conducting a gap analysis.
Carol, could you take just a moment to review the overall planning process?
Sure. To wrap up this module, we'll just do a quick review. First of all, we need to understand that the content for the IEP is determined through a planning process. It's much like using a GPS to figure out where we want to go, those desired outcomes or instructional results, then using our present levels of academic achievement and functional performance to do that analysis between what are the general education expectations, what are the students' current knowledge and skills, where's the gap, what does that say about the instructional need, that then leads us to writing the measurable goals, that leads us to selecting instructional services and program supports, that then leads us to implementation and monitoring progress over time, and then starting over again. The process is really dependent on data from multiple sources. We cannot look at just one data source. Some of that data might come from what we call our formal evaluation data that we used to determine whether or not a student is eligible for special education. If that is recent, some of it might come from formal evaluation that we conduct in the school or statewide assessments, that's a formal evaluation. But some of the data also might come from parents, from the classroom, from observing social interaction, from progress monitoring. So we want to look at a variety of data. Remember that before planning can begin, the determination of eligibility has already been made. So we know that the student is eligible for special education and as governed by IDEA because they meet certain requirements and they are already in need of the specialized services and supports. Good planning really starts with a discussion about the desired outcomes. It starts with saying, where do we want this student to be in a year from now, in 2 years from now, 3 years from now? When it comes to high school students at the secondary level, we know we have to have the conversation about post-school outcomes. That is a requirement. But before secondary, it's not really a requirement, but it is good practice. We need to understand that we're not talking, so in many cases, we don't want to just look at this as a one-year plan. We want to know where we're going to go 3 years from now so that our one-year plan is going to get us where we want to be in 3 years. The vision of the parent and the student is a good source of data. We don't often take time, I think, to stop and ask the parent, what is your vision for your student? Where do you want to see your student in 3 years from now? And we definitely often don't think to ask the student, although I have to say that there's a much greater focus today on student-driven or student-led IEPs. And when students are part of their IEP, this is a natural discussion. But it is a great place to really get parent and student involvement in the IEP process. We want to determine the instructional needs by conducting a gap analysis. And we do that by really doing a thorough job of looking at all of our information about where the student is and then comparing that with the expectations of the general curriculum. We want to include the data from the comprehensive evaluation as one source of information, but it might not be the only source of information. And oftentimes it might not even be the most pertinent information, because what we really want is we want information that really tells us what to do instructionally. And some of that information is best derived when we look at the expectations of the general curriculum and we look at performance of the child in the classroom versus performance in some isolated setting where we're doing a comprehensive evaluation that's based on standardized assessment. That basically is our overview of IEP, the IEP process, and why it is important to connect to standards. In Module 2, we'll really get into a lot of conversation about developing the present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, better known as present levels.
Thank you, Carol. We'll look forward to that.